Have you ever imagined what an Egyptian palace looked like? A metaphor for the cosmos, perhaps? Well, behold the columns, gateways, doorways, and windows, which this throne room model was based on. The Sphinx, one of the jewels of this collection, is said to be the third largest in the world. It came from the Memphis site, though under a different dig than the columns and such. It is carved from a single block of red granite, and it weighs about 15 tons. That's like 7.5 cars. It came to the museum in 1913, and get this, it was displayed outside in the courtyard, even in snowstorms, until 1916, when it was finally moved inside, and finally moved here in 1926. And no, the snow didn't erode its face off, though it probably didn't help. What saved the body was being buried in sand up to its shoulder. The remains of this royal palace, the best preserved ever, excavated in Egypt, stayed in relatively pristine condition because the palace complex was buried in a bed of mud and ash. And this is because a fire went through it shortly after Pharaoh Menentau, the 13th son of master builder, Pharaoh Ramses II, died. Now we're talking about 1200 BCE, and the site stayed buried until the time of excavation in 1915. Now, just as an FYI, the columns and gates are not at their normal height, but they're displayed in sections since they are taller than the ceiling here. Also, it's pretty obvious that Menentau was feared as a warrior. On the palace gates, the king is interacting with the gods, and the only humans depicted are enemies of Egypt, which he is smiting. And there is some proof of that based on the victory stele of Menentau, housed at the Cairo Museum. The text there largely recalls a victory over Libyans and their allies. There's even a mention of Israel. Now, going back to that cosmos analogy, even overlooking the obvious floral motifs and the columns reaching up for the heavens, there is a simplistic symbology in how the ancient Egyptians perceived their reality. You can see it by the depictions of mere mortals giving praise to Menentau, which happens in the lower portions of the columns, while up high, that's showing the pharaoh presenting offering to the gods. Okay, so there's nothing quite like taking a family portrait with the head from a 30-foot tall statue of Osiris. Day, he'd be lined up in a column with his mates, all staring down at you as you stepped into the temple of King Ramses II at Abydos, which, interestingly enough, is a city that the Egyptians believed Osiris was actually buried. I love that they have something from Hatshepsut, even if it is just defaced cartouches. If you don't know, she happened to be a female pharaoh who was almost erased from history. And here is a scribe that worked underneath her, Amenemhat. And here is Ramses the Great, who ruled for 67 years, the second longest reign that we know of for the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Probably his most notable battle was the Battle of Kadesh, where he fought the Hittites with a force 2.5 times smaller than his foe, and he returned home as a military hero, with both sides claiming victory. Highlights include 2 statues of the fierce goddess Sekhmet from a Theban temple of Amenophis. It would be fantastic if I could talk about every single item, but this museum has more than 42,000 objects just in Egyptian artifacts. This ranges from statuary to domestic artifacts, textiles, pottery, tools, and human remains. This one has a lot of personality. It's also part of a sarcophagus lid. Fascinating and sad. I'm not sure the age of the little boy, but I've read there was a spike in fatality for children after they were weaned at 3-4 years of age until they were about 5. And here we have the Book of the Dead for a sculptor who lived in the village of Deir el Medineh by the name of Nefer Renpet. These books were pretty important because they helped the newly dead navigate into their afterlife. I wonder how many pieces of artwork Nefer Renpet created during his life. There are various examples of mummy coffins in this gallery, from the roughly hewn to the brightly painted and highly decorated coffins, and some, like a Hanacht, they're completely covered with religious spells, known as coffin texts. Okay, so I have a name for the mummy here that is white-ish and laying on the ground. His name was Nebnetshru, priest from the god Amun at the Karnak temple. And yes, he had his own mummy case, but the top is displayed somewhere else. I'll point it out later, and the back will be displayed at a later date. Per this 5,000 plus year old mummy, it would appear that mummification began naturally when the Egyptians buried their dead in the sand, and eventually it expanded to their more complex forms and rituals. So the process of mummification would take about 70 days. The internal organs would be removed, except for the heart, and the body would be placed in a salt-like substance, which is, I suppose, easily found in Egypt. After the body dried out, it would be washed and oiled, wrapped, the head and face covered with a mask, and then placed in a series of coffins. Okay, here we see a funeral stele from Nefersekeki, an official and priest from the town of Venice. Happy Men, priest of Mut, was discovered in 1902 at Abydos, and Pom 2 shown totally unwrapped. He originally had 12 layers of linen, but had no name preserved on his coffin. Both men were around 35 to 40 years of age when they died, and both just recently went through their first CT scan. Did you know that they mummified animals too? Wooden models became popular during the first intermediate period as burial goods. Now, I don't think these are the same as the Shabtai statues, which the Egyptians believed were like little mini servants that would do the bidding of the deceased, but these models, they tend to give us a good idea of what everyday life may have looked like. One magic wand carved from a hippopotamus tusk and decorated with 9 magical figures. It's interesting to note that Tawarit, a hippo-headed goddess, was seen as someone who guided the dead into the afterlife and was also a protector of childbirth. Here we have a bronze depiction of the goddess Isis with Horus in her lap, and she is about 8.5 inches high. And here we have Thutmose III, who reigned in Egypt for almost 54 years. But get this, he was co-regent with his stepmother and aunt Hatshepsut for his first 22 years. The Amarna period was a brief but tumultuous time when Pharaoh Akhenaten introduced Aten, the sun god, to ancient Egypt and disbanded the priesthood of the other deities. His reign lasted 17 years, and afterwards his young son, Tutankhamun, reinstated the old gods. And yes, we're talking about King Tut, the boy king. Was he murdered? Mummy's curse, treasure trove, and the ancient attempts to strike him and his father from history. And now, instead of being forgotten, there is a modern fascination about the mystique of not just what happened, but why. Why did it happen? This tomb chapel was for a treasury official of the late Old Kingdom. It used to sit near the famous step pyramid at Saqqara, excavated in 1903 and sent to America for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904, afterwards donated to the Penn Museum. There's only 4 of its kind in the United States. A relatively recent exhibit, the Artifact Lab, provides a great interaction in seeing the conservation that goes into the artifacts. And this one seriously freaked me out. You can actually see the braids at the back of her head. Nephrina is the name of the woman this funeral mask was made for. A beautifully decorated New Kingdom coffin. And why are there 8 drill holes in the bottom? Let the theories begin. So I'd say, what a wonderful trade-off, knowledge for repairs for these inhabitants of the ancient Egyptian cosmos.